Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Game Changer sessions. It is episode 24 of the total series, and it is the fourth episode of our second series, really focused on the future of learning. As you all know, this session is really focused on two questions that I'm really passionate about. One, how do we create not just the future, but one that we want? And the second is, how do we learn the skills and mental models not to just survive, but to really thrive? And so our series on the future of learning is bringing some tremendous thought leaders, entrepreneurs, next-gen teachers, and investors to help us think about where the future of learning is headed. And we're doing this in partnership with a new company we're incubating called Mastermind, which is a live learning platform. And I'm so honored and excited to have the guest who I have on our show today. Before I tell you about him, I will just mention next week's guest is Matt Window, a longtime friend and somebody who is at the forefront of education. He's the Chief Business Officer of Lambda School, and he's also a partner at Graph Ventures. But back to today, I am delighted to have this guest with me. I've followed this guest from afar for a long time and have always wanted to be in conversation with him. Why? This is Shane Parrish, who we have in our show today. He is the CEO and founder of Farnum Street, an online learning community dedicated to helping people think better, live better, and perform better. Shane writes one of the best newsletters called Brain Food that I read religiously every week. He also has a phenomenal podcast called the Knowledge Project Podcast, where he interviews amazing guests. And he is the author of two books out of, I think, a series that's coming up called The Great Mental Models. And what I love about Shane is he has this curiosity and passion for learning, and he is a lifelong learner. So welcome, Shane. It's really great to be in conversation with you.
Thanks, Candice, for that generous introduction.
It's very easy to give it to someone like you. So Shane, as I mentioned from earlier, I've always wanted to be in conversation with you. And so this is a great, real privilege for me. And what I love about you is that you have this real passion and curiosity for what learning is. And so maybe we should just start there. How do you define learning?
That's an interesting sort of place to start. I think that a lot of people think about learning as experience, and we think that if we have an experience, then we've learned something. And I don't think that that adequately sort of represents how we go about learning. So to learn something, you not only need to have an experience, which can be something vicarious through other people, whether you're reading or through a conversation, or hands-on, which is an experience with yourself. But then you need to reflect on that experience, and you need to reflect on that conversation and reflect on all the variables in the situation. And then you sort of come to an abstraction, and that abstraction is basically what you'll do the next time you're in this situation. And that's the beginning of learning, right? But the abstraction leads to action. Action leads to an experience. And so you have this loop of learning where you have experience at the top, you have reflection, then you have abstraction, and then you have action. And when you think about that, it's really interesting because how we consume content, mostly on the internet these days, is all geared towards abstractions. We're consuming other people's abstractions, which is the illusion of knowledge. We don't know why it works. We don't know why it's like you're reading a recipe. You don't know why these ingredients give you this great taste, but they do. But when something goes wrong, we don't know why. And then we can't deal with the inevitable changes in the environment or the situation not being perfect. And so we end up operating in a world where we have to directly match everything. And so we haven't really learned. We haven't learned how to apply, how to associate things. What we've learned, if you consume abstractions, is how to get a direct match. So given the same information each time and the same situation, the same environment, we can get the same results. But if things start to change slightly, then you're in trouble. And my friend Tim Urban has a great analogy for this, which is the difference between a chef and a line cook, right? They can both follow a recipe. And if everything goes well, it'll taste very similar. But if something goes wrong, the chef can immediately diagnose why it went wrong. And the line cook might have a little bit of problem with that because they don't have the experience and the years of just honing the craft.
so much to unpack in this really rich explanation. And so I'm so curious because, you have created something that is so profoundly useful for people who want to learn, or at least abstract, one part of that process. Why did you build Farnum Street? What was it that led you to wanting to put this in the world?
Yeah, so I mean, I started working for an intelligence agency 2 weeks before 9/11, and as we all know, the world changed right after that, and I just got put into positions that I wasn't qualified for. I mean, we all were, right? We were just doing the best we could at the time, and that was what our country needed of us, and that's what everybody in the organization did. But you ended up doing things that you're not qualified to do, so you end up learning on the job a lot. And Farnum Street is basically my manifestation of like, how do I keep track of this learning? How do I organize it? How do I connect it? And it was never intended for public consumption. I mean, at the time it was created, it was literally 68131-1440 blogger.com or something, right? Which is the zip code for Berkshire Hathaway and the unit number in Kiewit Plaza. And it was just for me because I figured nobody would type in this random series of digits, and I didn't want to password protect the website because that was just annoying to have to log in. And so that was it. It was just my journey. Like, how do you chronicle your journey of learning, and what does that look like? And it's interesting because when we talked about learning and what the process of learning might look like, we talked about reflection, and writing is a key way to reflect, whether it's journaling every day or whether it's writing an article about what you're learning or paraphrasing what you're learning. That's when you learn what you don't understand. And then you can go back and start getting, start finding out where those areas of weaknesses are and developing them.
For sure. And I think what you say is so important in an age where there's such little attention, right? Where our attention is our scarcest resource. To your point, people don't take the time to sort of focus on, those two pieces. One, the reflection, right? And then the just the loop of what you're talking about, the understanding of the iteration of that loop.
Yeah, think about the reflection piece there just for 1 second. Sorry,
yeah,
I didn't mean to interrupt you. There's just a little bit of a lag, so it's fascinating because we don't actually want to take the time. We just want to consume, and what's new and what's novel, and then that leads us to increasingly consuming abstractions. And then the flip side of that is we're getting abstractions from abstractions. So now we're getting like meta abstractions, right? So if you think about if you take the learning loop that I mentioned earlier and you think about what implications that has, not only for conversations, but how you learn, it means that you seek out different sources of information. So if I'm going to learn from somebody else through their experience, I don't want to learn through somebody in between us. I don't want to learn through a filter. I want to learn from that person directly. I want to be as close to the source as possible. And what we have now is we have, a host of people summarizing summaries of other people's summaries. And, the farther down the chain you go, and the more it gets about sort of like creating content for the sake of creating content or driving page revenue or advertising, the less actual knowledge you're going to put in your brain.
I love that you sort of bring that up, because I think one of the first principles you talk about in your mental models is the map, versus reality, right? Or I can't, is that how you describe it? Which is, it's just the map,
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm just laughing on our back and forth. I think there's a little bit of a lag, so I apologize. No, just exactly what you're talking about, which is direct from source and timeless wisdom. Direct from source is something that is really interesting in your pursuit. It's not just about, direct to people who are living today. It's like there's timeless wisdom that you're interested in sort of bringing back to people of our age for this, for the purpose of understanding direct to source thinking or first principle thinking. And I'm curious if that's what you're referring to when you.
a couple things there. One, how can you build knowledge if it's always changing, right? You're on a treadmill, you're always just consuming, consuming, consuming. So, in your niche or your specialty, if you're a brain surgeon, you want to be consuming the latest and greatest information about brain surgery. That's true. But in life, you actually want to build a foundation that you can connect ideas on. And then that gives you the broad, not the deep, but the broad sort of interconnections that you need to make better decisions. The other thing, when you mentioned the map is not the territory, I think the best way to conceptualize that for people is online dating. I mean, even if you're not dating, you probably have a conception of what that means. Somebody puts up a profile or and it looks one way, and then you meet them in real life and you're like, whoa, this is nothing like the person. Or a resume, right? You get this amazing resume and you go for an interview with this person, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, these two things don't align. And so the map that you're getting, the summary, the presentation aspect of it, it doesn't align with the actual territory of that. So often
Mhm.
we run businesses that way, we run a whole bunch of things that way, and it's just fascinating to think about that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And you mentioned something, obviously Charlie Munger played a big role in you creating Farnum Street. And I was chuckling because I was also in business school when a friend of mine who had dropped out of business school was like, "Hey, you should actually read this almanac as opposed to going to those classes." And that's when sort of my love of his thinking happened too. But one thing you mentioned is this idea of expert generalist, basically of broad thinking, which Charlie refers to as being an expert generalist. And I'm very, very interested in, two things around being an expert generalist in a world of specialization. How do you take that mental model and also think about your circle of competence? Because one of your other mental models that I find so interesting is understanding what you don't know. And so I'm really interested in where there's seemingly conflicting ideas that aren't actually conflicting. And I would love your thoughts on how you think about merging circles of competence with this idea of being an expert generalist.
Let's approach this in a couple of different ways. One, I can approach it from my experience, right? So I had a computer science degree. I went to work, and then I started managing people. I didn't know anything about managing people. As you move up in the organization, you face different problems. You face strategic problems. You face political problems. You face a whole bunch of different challenges and obstacles in the organization. I had a
Mm-hmm.
computer science degree. I'm used to looking at zeros and ones and bits, right? So everything that I looked at unconsciously gets filtered through that lens. Here's what I know. I know how to solve these problems in this particular way, but that's not necessarily the best way to solve those problems. And the only way that you realize that, we're blind. We have blind spots. We all have blind spots. And especially the way our education system works, which is you start
Mm-hmm.
specializing, often in high school, and then you continue in university. And the reason you do that is to make yourself employable, and the employers want you to be able to contribute right away. So you need the vocabulary, and you need the way, you need to learn all the basics before you start at work. And then
Right.
that way you can get up to speed quicker. But it's all about employment. It's not necessarily about knowledge. And then you start
Mm-hmm.
making decisions, and you're blind to psychology. You're blind to math. You're blind to just the way that the world works. The world isn't one particular discipline, it's this interconnection of disciplines. And so, if you think about the source of all bad decisions that you make, it's always a blind spot. You're blind to
Right.
something. There's something you didn't know at the time you made the decision that would have changed your ability to accurately see what reality is. And the more of reality you can see, the fewer blind spots you have. And we're never going to eliminate our blind spots, but we can definitely start learning about timeless principles that apply across broader situations, like the map is not the territory or second order thinking. And we can
Mm-hmm.
apply those to different situations. And so often we don't do that. And so a basic knowledge of psychology helps you be a better leader, right? It helps you understand things better. Basic knowledge of accounting helps you be a better leader. And so when you start taking these different disciplines, not only can you communicate better with other people, you understand how that they learned and what they consider as important, which helps you take into account different perspectives and make sure that you're getting win-win solutions. And I think that so often we're just not doing that. We're just approaching problems in the way that we need to solve this particular problem. And we think that that problem is all there is, but it's not.
I absolutely love that. And what I've found so fascinating about your work is that you are taking mental models from all these different disciplines and bringing them to bear so that you aren't just looking, at ones and zeros when it comes to solving a problem. One of the questions I have for you is, are there any disciplines that you choose not to look at when you think about creating this great map of mental models? So, I know your next volume is on, chemistry and biology and physics, and you just mentioned psychology. But are there certain bodies of knowledge that you've chosen to not incorporate?
So with the Great Mental Models book series, which I'm a co-author of, and it's self-published, it's available on Amazon. You can just search for it. But the idea behind that is, what would if you went to the introductory class at university, in most of the disciplines, what would you learn that is timeless and replicates? So if you went in the 50s, you might have different vocabulary, but you would still learn the same thing. And if you go in 2050, you're still going to learn the same thing. Again, different vocabulary. And so that allows you to build upon the knowledge, because now you're learning something that doesn't expire. So to answer the question about what haven't we covered, we made a conscious decision not to include cognitive biases. Which is, maybe slightly controversial, but they don't tend to replicate. Knowledge of them doesn't tend to give you a leg up in actually avoiding them. There's a whole bunch of, just because you know about them doesn't mean you can solve them. And then there's really a meta bias, which comes back to physics and sort of relativity, which is, I think most of your listeners might remember physics class from maybe grade 8 or grade 9, and you have this ball and you're on a train, and the train is moving 60 miles an hour. How fast is the ball moving? Well, relative to you, the ball's not moving at all. But relative to somebody standing and watching the train go by, it's moving at 60 miles an hour. And all of our cognitive biases basically boil down to that one problem, right? We think that the system that we see with our own eyes is all there is to see, but it's not. There's a big interconnection. And another way to conceptualize that might even be easier than the train is, how fast are we moving right now? And you're like, well, we're not moving. But if we're standing on the sun, we're moving at 18,000 miles an hour around the sun. And so it's all relative to your perspective on the problem. And you need multiple perspectives or lenses into the problem to get closer to reality.
Very, very interesting. And so are you saying that you didn't cover that in the mental models framework? That's the one area that you're sort of not
Yeah,
diving into?
we stayed away from that. We stayed away from the only thing I think we cover from computer science is probably like algorithms or recipes, because those are repeatable, and the concept of which will help you understand policies and procedures in organizations, and it'll help you understand a whole bunch of other things. But yeah, we tend to stay away from anything that's new. I mean, it's just basically old, and we're not creating anything. We're just really helping people uncover. We're, as the tagline on the website says, we're mastering the best of what other people have already figured out.
I think it's so valuable, though, the way in which you are sharing this knowledge. So one of the things that you are known for, and I know a lot of people look to you for, is this idea of a decision-making framework. And my background is in strategy consulting. That was my education. I say it was like the MBA I never took was working at Monitor, which was a strategy firm at the time. Our job was to help people make decisions too. And I'm very interested why you focus on decision making, and what you talk a lot about a decision making template, and that people need to kind of be much more thoughtful in making decisions. Can you kind of unpack why the focus on decisions and what your template enables?
Yeah, so like we are in so many ways the product of our decisions, right? You start in life and you're born into a circumstance that you have no control over. You have parents you have no control over. You have a country that you have no control over. So you're put on this trajectory in life, and it is entirely luck. And for most of us, at some point, that luck becomes less over time, right? And we take control of our own lives. We become an adult, and at that point, we're responsible for our own decisions. And those decisions that we make, and luck factors in, so don't get me wrong, but those decisions will largely dictate our trajectory going forward. So somebody with less luck can actually sort of, if you think about a graph, overcome somebody with more luck based on the decisions that they make. If they're better at making decisions, the slope goes up, they go faster, better
Mhm.
results. And I think that it's really important to study how we make decisions, but there's no class in school called how to make decisions. And there can't be, because it's really all these interconnected disciplines. But we have a class called reading, but there is no one skill that is reading, right? You learn to recognize letters, you learn to put letters into words, words into sentences, sentences into paragraphs. And so you have all these different skills that combine into the skill of reading. So with decision making, we look at it as there's repeatable behaviors that go into making good decisions. And then there's a reflection aspect, which is what you hit on when you talked about sort of our decision journal, which if you go to fs.blog/DJ, you can pull it up. We have a template online. But really, all we're trying to encourage there, going back to learning again, is active reflection with your decisions. So often we make decisions, but we don't get better. We have experience, but we're not learning. And we all know somebody at work who's had 20 years of experience and hasn't, they've really repeated the same year of experience 20
Mhm.
years in a row. But so
Mhm.
often we do that with decisions, because who gives us feedback on decisions? Well, it's really hard to get feedback from your boss. It's really hard to give yourself feedback, because you have all of these sort of like, you do have hindsight bias and you have ego protection and you have all this other stuff going on. And so it's really hard to give yourself feedback after the fact, which is, what is my contribution to where we're at? And so the idea behind this decision journal is, before you make a decision, you can write down certain things that'll help you look back in the future. Not only help you look back, but it'll help you understand what you don't understand about the decision you're about to make. And so we recommend that people sort of write out the situation or context that they're operating in,
Mhm.
sort of the problem statement that they're trying to solve, and then identify the variables that they think are going to govern the situation, and how those variables will interact over time as you go forward. And then you sort of identify the complexity that you see. You talk about the alternatives that you're seriously considering. And then we recommend a paragraph explaining the range of outcomes. And that's really important, because I'll come back to why that's important afterwards. But the entire range, like, here's the lower bound, here's the higher bound. And so you're coming up with a probability distribution, and you think that that's going to be governed by the variables that you're identifying. And then you explain what you expect to happen and why. And then sort of I would advocate the time of day, how you're feeling mentally, even as much as what you've eaten. And then you haven't technically communicated at this point, communicated that decision to other people. You've just written it down, and that'll often just prompt you for, oh, I don't really understand this, or I want more information here. So before you've made the decision, now you have a sort of like check. But in reality, also 6 months later, you can go back and look, what did I know at the time I made the decision? And if you do this in your own handwriting, it really works wonders, because then you can't convince yourself that somebody else typed
Mhm.
that, or that wasn't really
Mhm.
you. And so you're looking at it, and now you get the feedback, right? So how do you calibrate your ability to make decisions? You need feedback on that. And by keeping a decision journal, you can calibrate your decisions and get accurate feedback on how you're doing. And the reason that I mentioned the range of outcomes and identifying the variables, and those are really hard things, because they put you in a situation where you can be wrong. And so often we're right. We get the right outcome with our decisions, but we get it for the wrong reason. And as an
Mhm.
individual, that's really important to identify if you want to continue learning. Why did I get that wrong? Maybe I don't know as much. Maybe this isn't in my circle of competence like I thought it was. Maybe the range of outcomes that I thought was possible wasn't wide enough, and other things happened. And I think that comes with a whole host of other issues, right? Most people stop doing a decision journal when they realize they consistently get the right outcome for the wrong reasons, and they're lucky.
Mhm.
And that's a really hard place to be, but that's where learning begins, right?
Right. I think that's so valuable. And one thing I'm curious about is how you think about the role of your intuition or your gut. And has anyone told you to stop overthinking, your decisions? And how do you think about that?
Well, it's really hard to develop intuition around decision making because you need the same environment, you need rapid feedback, and you need a lot of iterations, right? And those three things do not combine in most decisions that we make. You're constantly dealing with a changing environment. There's often a huge lag between the decision and the feedback. Not to mention, sometimes if
Mhm.
you're sort of in a management role, there's people between you and the feedback on the decision, and you're not getting a lot of iterations. So I think intuition plays an important role. But if you think about intuition and you believe that you have really good intuition, you should spend most of your time calibrating and checking that intuition. And so if you look at professional chess players, they have a finite board, fixed number of positions. That's a great game where you can develop a lot of intuition. But what do?
Mhm.
They spend most of their time before they move their piece calibrating their intuition. So it's like, I have an intuition about what this move is, but now let's check, let's verify, let's go through the math and all of the various scenarios that could play out. And so they're really spending a lot of time calibrating that. And that's not to say that you should do that for every type of decision. I think that we have this unconventional belief that you're either rational or emotional, and we should all make rational decisions. And I don't believe that that's true. You're somewhere on this continuum at all times. If you have a fight with your spouse, you're going to be more emotional than rational. If you
Mhm.
are making a financial decision, you probably want to be more rational than emotional. And
Mhm.
where you are on this continuum is really important to identify. And what you're really trying to figure out is, where does it serve me to be rational and where does it hurt me to be rational? And sometimes where it could hurt you to be rational, because that's kind of counterintuitive, is in a relationship. You don't often want to be the most rational person. You don't want to choose who you love based on ration. You want to choose who you love based on love. And that's very emotional. And that there's two parts of us that combine into all these decisions. It's just really important to recognize where you are on that continuum and whether that's helping you or hurting you make the best decision possible given the circumstances.
Very, very interesting. And one decision that you've made, I mean, you had a phenomenal career previous to this. You made the decision to be an entrepreneur and to be a creator, right? Ultimately. And so when you think about that decision as a rational decision, an emotional decision, or how you made that decision, help us understand, your decision framework in, deciding to be a creator in this world.
Yeah, I think for me, it goes down to regret avoidance, right? Like, I don't want to wake up when I'm 80 going, oh, I wish I would have done this other thing. And I think that that's where it boiled down to, right? I don't come from a lot. So, if I failed, it wasn't a big deal. I figured I'd survive. The kids would be okay. At the end of the day, what am I really losing? And I think that it's just a matter of, I want to live the life that makes the most sense to me. And I want to live a life that my kids are proud of too, right? Which is, you pursue your dreams and you sort of rationally pursue them, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And you also
Mm-hmm.
want to have an emotional connection to what you're doing. So many people hate their jobs, and
Right.
it sort of drives me crazy that people can spend 8 to 10 hours a day. And I get it, right? Like, there's a part of me that totally understands and empathizes with that. But there's a part of me that goes, maybe that's just not how I want to live. And
Right.
yeah, then I
I
left.
and look what you've been able to create. And so if we sort of dive into what you've created as a creator, you've built this phenomenal community. I think there's something like 300,000 people who, come to you and Farnum Street to really live better. And I'd love to understand what you believe is the future of community as it relates to learning. It's very, very different than people taking your course at school. How do you think about the role of community and, the internet in learning experiences?
Well, school tends to be transactional, right? So I think that that's a really hard place to be. Like, you develop friendships, of course, during school, whether you're doing your master's or your undergrad. And then you go to work and you have a community at work. I mean, a lot of organizations organize communities around certain topics, but it's really hard to
Mhm.
organize abundance an
Mm-hmm.
abundance of information and sharing and helpfulness is really hard in organizations because we've also, slightly pitted these people against each other. So if I work with you, it's like I want you to succeed, but only relative to me. So not so much. Or I want you to fail, but only relative to me. So not so much, right? I don't want you to get too far ahead of me or too far behind me, but everything I view is through my lens. So if you ask me to help you, I'm not really going to help you. I'm going to help you, but I'm not really going to help you. And a great example of that would be I bet you at everybody's workplace right now, there's one person who knows the one thing that's holding you back, and they've never
Mm-hmm.
told you. Why have they never told you? Right? If you really value the workplace and you want to make the workplace better and you want to make everybody there better, then it makes sense that you
Mm-hmm.
would tell people that, but you can't in the context of most organizations. And so I think online communities can offer a lot of different things that you can't get from other communities. We have a community called the Learning Community, and on the inside, we have professional coaches from all four major sports leagues. We have exceptional entrepreneurs, and nobody knows who anybody is, and they're all just trying to help each other, and nobody has any vested interest in it. So, in the sense of, I'm not giving you advice because I want you to succeed relative to me. I'm giving you advice based on my experiences that'll help you succeed, because I think that's the best advice that I can give you. And I think that we get out of the competitiveness and then we get into the actual learning and the actual giving. And it becomes really phenomenal and really incredible to take away titles, take away sort of status of people, if you will, and just boil it down to thinking and helpfulness and kindness towards other people. And how do we solve problems together? And I think that there's a huge aspect of that. And if you want to add another layer to this, you can think about what's the number one predictor of where people end up in life, and it's your peer group. And
Mm-hmm.
often we feel like we can't choose our peer group, but online you can choose your peer group, and you can choose to be around people who are slightly ahead of where you want to go, are better than you, who have all the habits that you want to adopt, who have all the skills you want to adopt. And you, just by being around those people, will start to adopt that way of thinking, that mindset, and you'll get better results.
So access and exposure to this community in and of itself is a learning experience. Is one thing I'm taking away, and certainly my experience. I'm curious, since the pandemic, a lot of physical experiences have been put on hold or put on ice. And you have an incredible array of ways that people learn with Farnum Street. It's everything from a free newsletter to books to I signed up for your pre-recorded course to see what that's like. And I know you used to do live experiences before.
Yeah.
What do you tell me about that? Tell me about the future of live learning experiences, and have you tried them virtually? And what do you think? Um, what's different about learning live with people in a synchronous way versus, an asynchronous community digitally?
Yeah, so I can only speak to our experiences and not being sort of pedagogical,
Sure.
sorry,
Yeah.
like background here. We experiment with what works and try to just go with what works, right? So uh, in person, what tends to work really well is learning from other people and not necessarily learning
Mhm.
from me or our content. So providing an environment where people can get the most out of the people at their table, and just making sure that we put really high quality people in the room and facilitate knowledge sharing that way. Online, it's different, right? Because then it becomes down to me teaching, and what does that mean and how does that work, and then how do we make it stick? Because I mean, it's really easy to put together some videos that sound good and make people feel good, but not actually change results. And so we've
Mhm.
only done a couple of online courses, the latest one being Decision by Design, which we just opened today, coincidentally, and it's open for 2 weeks. But that's all about 12 weeks will help you make better decisions. But what it is one skill a week for 12 weeks. You practice that skill, and that's where the learning comes in, right? Because that's where the reflection comes in. So if you think about how we learn again, you need the experience. So you need to take this skill, practice it. You need to reflect on it, which makes it your own. And then you need to create your own abstraction about what that skill looks like. And all the skills combined to layer on top of one another. And so you start building what are the things that consistently good decision makers do before every decision, independent of what that decision is. And it's not the stuff we're taught in school, like here's a spreadsheet or here's the expected value. I mean, we rarely do that in the real world. But what do we do in the real world is we want to keep options open. So we make decisions as soon as possible or as late as possible. But most of us make decisions in the middle, and that's the worst place to make decisions. And so we sort of go through all of these skills and we give people practical examples, but we really expect them, if they want to learn, to go and do the work. And I think that that's where it falls down, right? So you can produce 50 hours of video content, and people will feel great about watching it. You can be hilarious and a comedian and it's entertainment, but it doesn't actually change results. And our audience wants results, and they don't really care about humor, thank God, because I'm not very funny. But they want results, and we help them get results. And we know that because we follow up with people years after we've taught them something, and they're still applying it, and they still remember it, and they remember the names and the vocabulary that we've used, and they've shared it with people. And that's how we know that the way that we do it works.
So I want to dive deeper into that. You talk about that just by watching this content, it doesn't necessarily drive results. Have you thought about bringing groups of people together in a live context virtually? I know you talk a lot about the success of your live experiences in person. I'm curious if you think that's something Farnum Street will be thinking about in the future.
We've sort of thought about it. I don't think we're that clever, though. Like, we haven't found a way that works for us and our audience. And maybe somebody else will figure that out, and we'll just copy their idea. And I think that would probably be the path for us. But we've tried that in various ways over the last, I would say, couple of years, and it just hasn't. It feels good. We get a lot of good feedback on it, but when it comes to results, it's a bit different, right? So if we're going to do that from an entertainment point of view, then that's great. One-on-one tends to work really well with that. So if we can facilitate interactions within our community, and our community's actually facilitated a lot of this on their own, which is awesome. So it's organic, and they have these Friday calls, and everybody hops on and they talk about the pandemic and what they're experiencing, and that's great. And sometimes they'll hop on calls together. It's like, I have this problem. Well, instead of me typing for 20 minutes, like, why don't we just hop on a quick Zoom call? I don't know you, you don't know me, but let's hop on a quick Zoom call, and that way I can talk about it. And I think that there's a lot of value in that. I don't know how to do that in a group, though. I think that that's really challenging to get everybody's needs met in a group, because you have to talk to people where they're at. And if you want success over the long term, you need a win-win. And it's a lot easier to get a win-win directly between two people than it is to get a win-win between 20 people, right? Because all those people need a win-win between each other. And I think that that's much harder to facilitate. If you think about sort of applying mental models, which we talked about earlier, one of the mental models that we teach is sort of like, in biology, what matters is survival. But we all learn that, but we never really apply it outside of biology. And if you want to apply it outside of biology, you start thinking about that. Well, what about my relationships? Like, how does that apply to my relationships? And there's 4 permutations of a relationship, right? There's win, win-win, win-lose, lose-win, and lose-lose. And only one of those relationships will survive over time. And what else do we want in life? We want to compound our progress. And that's a mathematical concept. Most of us learn it in finance, but we never apply it to the real world. And so we want a long duration, which is biology teaching us survival. And we want to compound things, which is mathematics teaching us that most of the results come at the end and not at the beginning. And then we can apply this concept of our relationships to that, which is we want win-win relationships, because that's the only thing that's going to survive, which means it's the only thing that can compound over time. And I think that that's a really good way to do it. And we all know what it's like to be on the other side of that, right? Where we feel taken advantage of, or somebody has has taken advantage of us even temporarily, right? We feel like a
Mhm.
negatively coiled spring, and the worst part of us wants revenge or wants them to fail or wants out of that relationship. I think if we're honest with ourselves, if that person falls on their face, we're sort of like, they deserved it.
Hmm.
And that's just sort of like, we call that karma, right? But in reality, we don't want to be in relationships like that. And we don't want to engage in relationships like that with anybody because they don't survive, they don't compound, and therefore they're not beneficial.
Definitely agree. And so on that, I'm really curious around your thought on the future of institutions, because in many ways, um, you could argue, and a lot of people do, that spending, 70, $80,000 on an MBA today is not a win-win relationship, as a result of how the world has changed and what mental models and skills people need to thrive. So, what do you think? Do you think, what's the future of institutions as when it comes to learning?
Well, I think you're right, and you might be missing something there, which is you're right in the sense of from a pure learning basis, it might not be the most direct route to an outcome. But from an optics point of view and everybody who's involved in that ecosystem, it makes a lot of sense, right? So if you're an employer and your employees want continued development and you are paying for their MBA, it makes sense for them to get an MBA. You get to keep them longer, you pay for it, but you tie them up for 4 to 5, 6 years as you lock them in. The MBA can be super expensive because it's being paid for by an institution, not by a person. The employee in this case, or the person taking the MBA, sort of gets placated for a couple of years before they realize that maybe that's not what they actually wanted, and then they stay trapped. So, from an optics point of view, it seems to work for everybody in the ecosystem at the moment, anyway. But from a real live learning point of view, it's different, right? And that goes back to there's different lenses that we can apply to these problems. And there's often when something doesn't make sense to us, there's often we're looking at it through the wrong lens. We might be looking at it through the correct lens. This is the way the world should operate, but we're not looking at it through the lens of this is how the world does operate. And I think that too many of us spend time in the should space instead of just accepting the way that the world works and trying to work with it instead of against it. It's the difference between having a tailwind and a headwind, and that makes a massive outcome difference.
It's really interesting what you're saying. And what I'd love to understand in my mental model is, how do you think about innovation in the context of the way things work versus the way things change? Because one of the things you're commenting on is there's a whole bunch of incentive structures that make the system stay the system. And yet, my friend who's going to be coming on board next week is Lambda School, that's changing that system, creating a new economic model, a new business
Mm.
model for how schools should work. So how do I think about that? What am I missing? Where are my blind spots around innovation in the context of models that are traditional today?
Well, I think that there's a difference between changing it from the inside and changing it from the outside, right? So they're changing it from the outside and they're saying, here's a better way to do it. We're going to prove it with results. And they're rapidly achieving that, I think, beyond reproach, right? But what's not happening is the inside's changing, right? So you're not seeing that model be copied by the very people who have the incentive to keep the system the way it is, because that would be admitting that their way isn't the best way. And so you have these two competing models, and eventually just one of them collapses.
Right. And so what I'm hearing you saying, it's really hard to change it from the inside, but there
Well,
are
you can
competing
yeah, you can make incremental change from the inside, but we all. I mean, anybody who's worked in a large organization knows it's like beating your head
models.
against a brick wall to try to get something to change. Sometimes, especially if you worked in a government institution or like a large bureaucracy with like 3 to 4,000 or more people, you're not going to change. And there's a saying in the military that's sort of like the uniform doesn't fit anymore, which means that the military is not going to change. You've changed and you need to get out. And I think that that applies here too, right? So if you have a better way of doing things or you think that you can contribute, then you have to put those ideas to the test, though. And the way to put them to the test is you have to go out in the real world and you have to be willing to be wrong and be embarrassed by the fact that you're wrong because you believe in these ideas so much. But that's how progress is made, right? It's extinction. It comes back to evolution again in biology, and we have these competing things, and they compete for scarce resources. In this case, students, jobs, all of these things, and the better solution tends to win over time. It doesn't mean that both solutions don't exist, but over time, one of them becomes less and less important, and then it just becomes irrelevant, and then it pops up again at some future point in maybe 1,000 years, and that's a more relevant solution than the one that is winning today.
Absolutely. And I think that's such a great way of framing that, and just remembering the compounding of time as these new solutions come to bear. So, my last question, and then I'd love to turn it to our audience because we have some amazing questions here, is I know you're a dad and I know you have kids. So do I. I have two boys. And I'm really interested in what are the skills and values that are really important to you in teaching your kids. I think they're going to live in a very different world than maybe we grew up in. Um, what advice do you have around thinking about the future for your kids?
Oh man, that's crazy. I do have two kids. I have an 11-year-old and a 10-year-old, both boys. I have no idea what I'm doing. I just try to figure it out every day. I feel like I'm not the only parent in that boat, but I definitely feel that most days. I want them to be kind over clever. I want them to make the world a better place. I sort of want them to be able to think for themselves. I don't have any expectations of anything, but COVID's been a great example of like, oh, well, this
Mm-hmm.
is in the news. How do you think about that? Like, do you believe what these people are telling you? Who's
Mm-hmm.
responsible for you at the end of the day, right? So you have this situation, and this is great, right? So the one of the benefits of COVID, I don't wish it on the world, but it's here, so there's no point in fighting it. Is it's an opportunity to teach kids about something happened. It's outside of your control. What you do control is how you respond to it. And you need to be able to think in situations where people around you can't think, right? So in February, we went to the grocery store and we bought a whole bunch of extra food provisions before anybody even thought of doing this. And the kids are like, what are you doing? Because I came home and I put it on the dining room table and we started talking about this thing working its way through the planet. And I was like, well, let's think about this. What do we really value? We value being prepared for multiple outcomes. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not trying to predict what's going to happen. I'm trying to prepare for a wide range of scenarios. So we get some extra rice and we get some beans just in case grocery stores shut down. And I think that, it was a great lesson for them because they were like, huh. And I was like, well, what's the cost of being wrong? And it's like a couple
Mm-hmm.
$100. And what's the
Right.
cost of being right? Well, we have food if other people don't have food. And just walking through the math with them about that, and then leaving it on the dining room table, which was a reminder that sort of what ended up happening because they remember getting sent home we pulled them from school right before it got shut down, but they came home and they're like, it looks like you were right. I was like, well, I didn't predict anything. I wasn't really right. I just sort of
Mm-hmm.
prepared for a different variety of outcomes. And that's how we want our kids to be, right? We don't want them optimized for one particular future. We want them to be able to think about a lot of different futures. And a lot of what we're reading with the advice coming out, especially in Ontario, is very specific, and it's predicting things like how the virus transfers, and it's predicting. And so the lesson that I try to teach the kids, and it probably doesn't resonate as much with them as I'd like, is, well, what if they're wrong, right? And who's responsible? You're ultimately responsible for your health, right? The
Mm-hmm.
government is not responsible for your health. You are. And so, well, this whole mask thing came out, and I was like, well, what if they're wrong? Maybe we do need masks. And so we got masks. And, it turns out that masks, do not harm you and
Right.
massively prevent at least more of it getting into your body. And we know that it seems verifiable that the higher dosage you're exposed to, the worst case that you have. So if we can reduce the dosage and there's no downside, then that seems like a logical thing to do. And so it's talking to the kids about these problems that are like, these are adult problems, but at the end of the day, I need to help you learn how to think. And I don't even know if my thinking is that great, but we're going to think about this together and we'll see where we end up.
I couldn't agree more with your approach, and I think it's so refreshing, to treat your kids in a way that allows them to have exposure and access to different mental models. So I love that you're putting that into practice with your kids, and lots of inspiration for sure for our community. So we have a ton of questions, and I know you don't have a ton of time, Shane. So I want to dive right to our community. Who have some really interesting questions. So the first question that I'm going to ask is, what are the common links and differences to your approach with Munger's lattice work and Ray Dalio's principles in the decision process and mental models? And I recognize we don't have a ton of time, but maybe you can highlight one or two of those.
I think Dalio's principle. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think they align very well. I mean, what we're trying to do with mental models and what Munger advocated was sort of learning the big ideas of the world and then incorporating them into the way you live. Dalio approached it. My understanding, it's been a year since I read that book, but my understanding is slightly differently, which is in line with that approach, but not necessarily based on physics, chemistry, biology, systems, numeracy, all these different disciplines. It was more of a practitioner's manual where we're trying to, that doesn't tend to work in practice. Again, that comes back to you're reading an abstraction by somebody who practiced it. So it might have worked for them, but what you're consuming is the abstraction, not the reflection. And so we're trying to build it up the other way, which is like, here's the experience. You go to these classes, we're going to help you reflect on it. And then you're going to draw your own conclusions because that's how you learn. But that doesn't make for a best-selling book. So.
Thank you. So our next question is from Ryan. He is excited because he met you at a wine night a few years ago, and he had a great time chatting with you and other attendees. And it's Ryan Puddicombe. How would you try and replicate this dynamic and free-flowing face-to-face conversation online? Do you think it's possible given our current technology? And could technology ever provide that same level of connectedness that we experience in person?
I don't know the answer to any of those questions. I'm sorry. I don't know. Like, I think we can get a lot out of online stuff and one-to-one, but I don't know if we'll ever replicate sort of like the Ready Player One, I touch you and you feel it on your shoulder, haptic suit, or all the micro expressions. I mean, like we're experiencing it here. There's a delay. We're 2020. We both have high speed, great camera setup, everything, reliable internet in one of the best countries in the world, and we have a lag. And I think we'll be continuously faced with problems like that inevitably. And then you just don't have the texture because you're looking at something in 2D versus 3D too. And I think that there's something there. I don't think we've quite hit on what it is yet. And I don't know if I understand it well enough to explain it.
Thank you. I think one of the things I learned from you is really acknowledging what you know and don't know. And I've really taken that to heart. So I appreciate you sharing that you don't know. My next question is a really great one from Graham Blair. He says, Shane, what does your information diet look like? And what do you wish existed to help people be more mindful of how they invest their attention?
I think one thing that I wish existed that would help people be mindful is like an old newspaper just in your inbox every day. Like you could read headlines from like 10 years ago and see how irrelevant they are today. Because so much of our time is consumed by news. I don't consume almost any news. I consume business news, which is really interesting because that gives me a filter. If there's anything major in politics or going on in the world, it sort of makes its way into business news, but it makes its way into business news in a it's not trying to get your attention as hard as it is on the other way, right? It's not trying to stir emotions. I try to generally stick with things that don't expire. And that means that like if our our articles should exist in 10 years and be as relevant as they are today. Hopefully that's the case. But I also want to read and consume like that. So a lot of what I spend time on is sort of going back and or pulling out lessons from modern books that I would say are just timeless lessons within the book, and then that offers a recontextualization of that. So I consume a lot of that. But I also just try to make space for thinking, right? Like a lot of it doesn't do any good to just consume, consume, consume. I mean, we get all get in this pattern of I'm driving to work, I'm listening to a podcast, I'm using the bathroom, and I'm like checking, I'm reading a paragraph, and I'm in line at the store, and I'm doing this, and that's great. But if you're just consuming, you're not digesting, you're not reflecting, and if you're not reflecting, you're not really learning, and so you're just on this treadmill of consumption. And I try to make space for actually just digesting what I've consumed.
I think that's a huge takeaway from today, is just how much we need to be much more reflective, or create the space for reflectiveness and put things into action to test them. So I really appreciate you sharing that. We have 2 minutes left, so I'm not going to ask any more questions. But Shane, I'm going to post these questions on our Twitter, and maybe if you're so inclined, you're welcome to answer them, because we have a bunch of really great ones still. But I just want to say thank you so much for joining us on Game Changer Sessions, and from being so generous and so kind and so curious around your work, so that so many people in this world can benefit from these timeless ideas that can make a huge impact on, how we actually create a future we want, and how all of us can learn to, not just survive, but actually thrive during these times that are uncertain and changing so fast. So Shane, thanks so much. Really appreciate you joining us today. I also want to, before I let you go, just say a quick thank you to all the people who made this happen. We have an amazing partner, Either Live. Thanks, Nathan. And it's executive produced by my husband, actually, Corey Marr. So thank you. And we have an amazing team at Game Changer, Maggie, Jerome, and Samantha. Thank you so much. And you will see this series be syndicated to our awesome live stream partners: Toronto Life Insider, York University, General Assembly, the Knowledge Society, Getting Smart, TechTO, Rotman, CIX, and W North. And a huge thank you to my partner in Mastermind, where we're thinking about all the things you're thinking about, of what does the future of these live learning sessions look like. Shane, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Candice.
Great. Have a great week, everyone. Take care.